Hello, everyone. I'm Gail Persicelli, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's ILTA webinar, How to Manage SharePoint Without a SharePoint Team. Our speakers today are Ted Theodoropoulos, who is the founder and president of AcroWire, and Brian Goff, solution architect, also with AccuWire. I would like to thank AccuWire for hosting this webinar. Their sponsorship is vital in keeping the ILTA webinars free to our members. Today's presentation will run approximately 45 to 60 minutes, and please submit all questions to the Q&A box, and if those are not answered during the presentation, they will be addressed at the end. Before we start, please know that we are recording today's webinar, and we'll post a link to our website under recording shortly after today's presentation. I will now turn over the webinar to Ted and Brian.
Thank you, Gail. So as many of you know, our main focus here at AcroWire is legal, but we also have some clients in other industries. And what inspired us to do this webinar is that we have seen a trend in legal that we see less of elsewhere and in other industries. And that's a disparity between how SharePoint is used and how it's managed. So today we're going to take a look at how SharePoint is being used in law firms, why it's so important that it be managed properly, and then we're going to discuss strategies that you can employ to reduce your reliance on dedicated SharePoint staff. So quick introductions. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, founder and president of AcroWire. Been in the business of technology for many years. I had stints on the SQL Server team at Microsoft, and as well as Bank of America in several risk management roles, including IT audit and operational risk. I've been lucky enough to get nominated for ILTA's Vendor Thought Leader of the Year 2 years in a row. And I'm also a certified Scrum Master and Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. And I will let Brian introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. So I am one of the solution architects with AcroWire, and I specialize in the SharePoint arena. I have many years with Microsoft Technologies. I've been working with SharePoint since the very early versions, even before SharePoint 2003. I originally started as a developer, and over time just kind of morphed more into the SharePoint Farm Administrator role. Through my years of working with SharePoint and sharing my experiences, I was twice recognized as a Microsoft MVP for touting and working with the SharePoint product. Look forward to hoping to give you all some good information on how you can keep your farm up and running in the best possible way today.
Okay, great. So let's do a quick introduction of AcroWire for those of you that don't know us. So we're an IT consulting firm, and we do a significant amount of work in legal services. So most of the consulting work that we do revolves around the Microsoft technology stack, and primarily in the SharePoint and application development space. So there are lots of vendors out there that can build solutions on Microsoft technologies, and how we try and differentiate ourselves is based on our focus. So we bring knowledge to the table that a non-legal vendor can't, like what other law firms are doing with SharePoint or application development, what they've found success with, where they've had failures. We know all the systems that your firm uses, including your DMS, your CRM, your finance system. And I think, most importantly, we understand law firm culture and how to operate effectively in it. Our commitment to legal is deep. I speak at SharePoint Symposium, ILTACon. We do a bunch of webinars and articles every year. So it's really important to us that every AcroWire customer be a happy customer. We have kind of three practice areas: SharePoint, which we're going to talk about today, and application development, which we're not going to talk a lot about. And then we also do envisioning, which helps law firms kind of get started on the right foot and implement some solid project leadership, especially around an intranet project where so many intranets touch so many parts of the business that starting out and gathering requirements from the full set of stakeholders is a really important part of the process, and one that sometimes gets overlooked. Okay, so let's take a look at our agenda. So we did introductions. We're going to talk very quickly about some use cases of SharePoint in law firms. Brian's going to talk through what makes SharePoint SharePoint, and then we're going to get into some strategies in the areas there that you see to reduce your reliance on internal staff. There's really no magic bullets, but there are some solid ways that you can employ to eliminate that reliance. So let's take a look at how law firms use SharePoint. And earlier I alluded to there was a disconnect between how law firms use SharePoint and how it gets managed. So this is a snapshot of ILTA's tech survey, and the question here was, which statement describes how your firm uses SharePoint? So I realize there are firms of all sizes on the call, but for simplicity's sake, let's just kind of focus on that last column to the right. So for these large firms, more than half are using SharePoint as an extranet, which is circled there in blue, and almost 3/4 use it as an intranet, which is circled in red. So intranets touch every person inside your law firm, or they should, right? Any intranet worth its salt should be the goal. Extranets touch at least some and possibly all of your customers. So, based on that information, SharePoint is very likely a critical system, and one that needs to be managed carefully. So let's take a look at the SharePoint team skill sets, like what an enterprise SharePoint team looks like. So we've made a solid case that SharePoint is critical in most firms. And if you're managing SharePoint on-prem and you're using it for those intranet, extranet scenarios, these are the roles that you need to think about. Now, the reality is that not every firm is going to need every role, but if you don't have one of these roles, you'll likely need to do one of three things: outsource, automate, or eliminate. And Brian's going to talk through some strategies to do exactly that. So let's just kind of briefly go over each role here. So SharePoint administrator, that's obviously a key role. This is the person who designs your farm and stands up that infrastructure. They're also responsible for keeping the environment up and running and performing appropriately, which we all know with SharePoint, that's not always an easy task. So, this person would monitor and keep ahead of infrastructure needs. And it really is one of the most critical roles on the team, simply because if this person doesn't do their job, the environment isn't going to run or run properly. Then we have a solution developer. And this is another key role, especially if you've deployed third-party frameworks or you host any line of business apps or customizations in SharePoint, which we see a lot of in legal. There are vendors out there that sell their products and frameworks, and the marketing message is that you don't need this role. And our advice is be skeptical of that. The ILTA forums are a great way to see what other firms are experiencing with a product, and whether or not you truly need a technical resource on your side to help manage that framework. A UX engineer or integrator. So if you want good user adoption, you need to provide a good user experience. And using the default SharePoint out of the box look and feel doesn't usually get you there. So again, it's a role you need to think about. Can you justify an FTE on your staff to do nothing but SharePoint design? I mean, if you're a really big firm, maybe. If not, maybe that's something that you outsource. Search and social administrator. We bucketed a lot into this role, and the reality is that you could spend an entire career just focused on SharePoint search. There's people out there that do that. That's not always practical. So getting someone who's proficient in search and adding some responsibilities around social is a realistic strategy. So if you're using SharePoint as an enterprise search platform, and I don't have those stats in the deck from the tech survey, but if you look at ILTA's tech survey, a very large percentage of firms use SharePoint for exactly that, and it does a really good job. So if you're using SharePoint as an enterprise search platform, you need some specialized skills to tune it and provide the best search experience, because if users go to SharePoint to search for something and can't find it quickly, they're not going to come back. And then we have a business liaison, and this is another role that wears a lot of hats. But essentially, this person is the face of the SharePoint team. So they need to have an understanding of the business, which is key when you're designing your governance policies. And they also need to have a feel for the firm culture. And that's going to allow the SharePoint team to create a look and feel and a navigational structure that resonates with users and aligns with the culture. We oftentimes see these folks come from knowledge management. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Brian to talk about strategies to reduce reliance.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Ted. So one of the things I wanted to do first is get kind of a level set about, when we're referring to SharePoint and managing SharePoint, what will we be touching on here in the following slides? When you ask somebody, what is SharePoint, most of the time you're going to get folks saying, oh, well, it's a website or a web portal, something like that, and which is a very true statement. However, again, for the purpose of what we want to cover and folks who have installed and run SharePoint, we know there's a lot more to it, all right? So you definitely have the different sites and the content that you have, but there are the servers that are running the SharePoint product. You have databases that's holding the content and your information about your SharePoint farm. The physical content themselves, the documents and the list, the calendar entries, etc. You also have possibly different apps. Have you installed any custom apps from in-house development or any third-party companies that you might have purchased some apps and installed to help enhance the features and capability of your SharePoint farm? So what we want to touch on today is looking at several of these different aspects and some alternatives as far as hiring full-time SharePoint specific people. How can you maybe leverage some other resources that you already have or external resources to help manage your SharePoint farm? So let's first look at the servers. So again, we know that there is no single bullet and single framework with everybody. So we're going to go on the assumption that your legal firm does have some servers and some kind of an IT department at some level. And somebody's already responsible for your hardware. Who's been helping you with everybody's PCs and keeping your network internally up and running and doing what they need to do. So you can leverage that same group of folks to help with your SharePoint servers. They're still hardware. They're still running the Windows operating systems, right? It's still IIS. So these are some areas that they probably are already somewhat familiar with to one degree or another. So they can be the ones to help continue to maintain the SharePoint servers, just like they're maintaining any of the other servers in your network. So these will be the same resources to help you with, installing any of the SharePoint updates, the server updates, handling your security, right? These are, again, roles, these are tasks that they're doing for all the other servers. We just extend it to say, okay, you are also responsible for the SharePoint servers, okay? Now, certain SharePoint, depending on what version of SharePoint you have, some of the SharePoint updates and cumulative updates might need a little bit more care, and if your network team is not familiar with them, they might need to do a little bit of reading on the README files and how to install them. But sometimes you might have to install things in a very specific order for SharePoint to make sure it stays happy. But all that information is available on the web, and it's part of the packages, the cumulative updates packages that they download to install. So it shouldn't be anything too difficult for them to pick up and do properly. Do you have something to add, Ted?
Yeah, I do. So I think the key word here is managing your servers. Something that's not advisable that we see, unfortunately, often is pulling in your network team to stand up your SharePoint farm. There are some best practices and some lessons learned that if you just go out there and read the documentation, it is a big ask to get a network engineer who's never architected a SharePoint farm to throw them at MSDN or TechNet and have them come out of the other side with a properly configured SharePoint farm. They can manage it once it's once it's up and running and installed, just keeping the lights on and keeping things in maintenance mode. But again, we're emphasizing the word managing here, and not architecting.
Okay. We mentioned, again, what are ways to help manage? Each environment may have their own set of tools, but it does help to leverage tools that are out there so that you can really get a lasso around all the different hardware that you might have to, be asking your team to deal with. So products like Microsoft System Center, their Service Manager. There are other tools out there, and I'm sure your company already has some flavor of a tool that you're used to working with. And again, they should be able to leverage those products. SharePoint is widely known enough that most of your common products for managing hardware and network systems would be SharePoint aware, if you will. So they know what special settings or things might need to be in place for it. So definitely leverage those tools. Be aware of the tools that are out there and get those in the hands of your team to work with. One of the other components we'll look at are the databases. So again, SharePoint is very reliant, 100% reliant on SQL databases. You may or may not already have, SQL databases in your particular setup, your firm. But the concept of databases, if you are using some other type of database, hopefully you've got somebody who is that database administrator, who's responsible for keeping whatever version of a database you have up and running, responsible for maintaining it, making sure that it is performing the way the databases need to. You've got the space that you need for the log files and all the interaction, and they are also working with the backups and restores. So it's definitely especially helpful if they are already familiar with SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server. That will definitely go a long way for them to be able to continue to maintain and manage the SharePoint databases. So it's already in their wheelhouse. If they're that database, they have that information. SharePoint isn't that different. It's got a number of different databases. As long as they know, what those databases are and what they're used for, it's monitoring the same thing. Do you have enough disk space, or is the logging happening? Are you able to perform your backups, and are you able to perform your restores? Make sure you test and prove out your restore process, please. It's one that is overlooked quite often in different departments. And again, some tools. How can you help empower your existing team to take on these kinds of tasks and do them more quickly and easily? So again, System Center, Service Manager, or products like SQL Sentry are a couple of the tools. Again, there are many, and you may have your own flavor of tool available in your environment already. So just be sure to leverage those. And the SharePoint databases, same thing. Just let your teams take care of that. There may be some tweaking or some information for SharePoint specific needs, but again, it's available out there on the internet. It's on TechNet. It's on MSDN. So the information's there to get them moving along.
And Brian, I would just add to that: if you don't have database administrators, or you've got DBAs that aren't especially deep in keeping ahead of the underlying infrastructure, because SQL can get very complex, as we all know, with clustering and high availability and business continuity, disaster recovery. There are fractional DBA resources out there, and that's something that AcroWire does. If you do either assess your existing team and realize that there are gaps there, or you want to outsource the management and monitoring altogether, take a look at what fractional resources are available from companies like ours.
Okay, thank you, Ted. The next component is the actual SharePoint content itself. So you may have heard a term used it's been around for some years, called SharePlosion. SharePoint is, one of the, that's the good news, bad news, right? So it's easy to create subsites and document libraries and other lists. And it's because of that ease, it's also easy to lose control of it. People will create subsites or other libraries for a temporary project maybe, or they built it just because they were trying to see what it was, and they leave it hanging out there. They don't clean up afterwards. So, over time, that just continues to grow and grow, and nobody's managing it and taking care of it. Largely because there wasn't a governance plan. There isn't somebody overseeing the actual content and how you're leveraging SharePoint, right? So to manage that, again, we mentioned the governance plan. Have a governance plan and make sure you communicate that out to your team well. Make them aware of what you're doing. And as long as you empower them, you make sure they understand the good and the bad, what is the naming conventions you're going to use, what content should go into SharePoint and what content shouldn't. There may be content that just should not go into SharePoint for one reason or another, okay? So make sure that is all very clearly communicated to your team. Controlling the permissions. Controlling, that helps to control the SART architecture. So make sure you've got a very small group of people that are allowed to create additional site collections or subsites, right? Who are these folks, and make sure they, again, are informed on what your policies are, what is the best practices, what you want to do. A general rule of thumb is you don't have subsites that go more than 3 deep, right? Again, there may be, certain areas where you need to do that. It's just a recommendation. It's a best practice, a rule of thumb to try and follow. But getting that information out to folks and making sure they are aware of it before you release them to your SharePoint world. Get ahead of the game. Make sure they're told and informed ahead of time. Now, once they have started using it, what are some tools? So rather than having somebody that's constantly going through and trying to look at your 50, 100, whatever number of sites that you might have and all the different libraries that could be out there, there are some SharePoint farms that have gotten quite large. And it's asking a lot to have somebody go through and monitor and look at this to make sure everybody's behaving well. So what are some tools that can help with these kinds of scenarios? ShareGate is one of the tools that we've worked with and have been very happy with. Metalogix also has a version of their tool and another tool called Engage. And I'll give you a little bit of background on each of these tools. So the Metalogix and the ShareGate product, they have their own kind of implementation of different capabilities to provide some reporting for exactly, as I mentioned, with governance plan. Make sure there's no sites that have more than 3 subsites deep. You can set up some reports to look for that and have those jobs run on some, different timetable, and it will scan, create the reports, and then let, some identified individual or team of individuals be aware that, hey, something has gone outside of our standards here. What are some of the naming standards that you might use? Have you enabled versioning on a document library, but you didn't set any version limits? These are just some samples of different settings that you can do, get some reporting, get that information so that you can try and stay ahead of the game. The sooner you know about a potential problem or somebody straying outside of what your governance standards are, the sooner you can get a handle on it and keep it under control, right? In regards as far as, again, with permissionings and who's doing what, right, managing that SharePoint content, you might also have to have some auditing to let you know who is getting into what content to make sure the permissions have been applied properly. Engage is a very powerful product that can really dig down and give you a large wealth of information about your users and information. You can, because it uses a cube, you can really look at the data in a variety of different ways. You might be able, for some reason you need to know, well, what content has Bob been looking at in the past month? And so you can have a report specific to Bob. It'll give you all the feedback to tell you every site, every document, every list that he's done any kind of reading. Or if you want to know where he has been editing content, it can give you that feedback. Or if there's a specific site or a specific library, or even down to a specific document that you wish to know who has been interacting with this document at some level, who's been reading it, who's been changing it over whatever period of time that you designate for it. So getting that audit information, depending on what kind of compliance you are trying to adhere to or what issues you might be trying to address, the Engage product can be a very good product to give you that kind of information as well.
Hey, and Brian, I was just going to say another thing about governance. Governance is something that is not sexy. It's not fun. People don't leap out of bed in the morning and run to go draft a governance plan. However, it's one of the most important things that you can do, especially in legal. And the reason is you guys have a document management system that every law firm over 50 attorneys has one for the most part. And there are rules that say where work product is supposed to live. And that may or may not include SharePoint. So we've seen firms that will move work product temporarily into SharePoint, enable co-authoring. Once the final work product is completed, it moves back into the DMS. We've seen it where there's been a blanket provision where no work product is to be uploaded into SharePoint, and content is surfaced from your document management system. So surfaced instead of stored in SharePoint. So a governance plan can be something very simple. We've had very long engagements where we took months to hammer out all sorts of details. This wasn't in legal, but for bigger firms. And it could be a 3-page document and something that you can draft in just a day or two. But it's worth doing. So we recommend that you think about that, and it will prevent a lot of problems down the road.
Excellent. Yeah. And again, to Ted's point, there are some companies that just really go way overboard and try and cover every possible scenario everywhere, and they end up with like a 30, 50-page governance plan. That one, you're really not going to get a lot of acceptance for it, probably. Who wants to sit and read through that 50-page document about the governance plan with it? So that's something to keep in mind. What do you really need to govern? What do you need to convey? And getting the rules in a nice, concise manner, then it'll be consumed by your end users much more quickly, and you have a better chance that they're going to adhere to it. Okay. So also within SharePoint, there are many different features and capabilities for what we call service applications. So such things as search, that Ted has touched on in the past. We have Excel services, Word services, video services. So there's user profile synchronization service. So these service applications are components, pieces of your SharePoint farm to provide very specific kinds of capabilities. Now, we're not aware of third-party products to manage, say, your Excel services or your user profile service. Just because they are so niche to and embedded in the SharePoint world, there just aren't that many, if any, third-party products for dealing with some of that. Now, when you're initially installing some of these products, and again, we've got a large variance, right? So depending on what your particular needs are, the size of your firm and how you're trying to use some of these service applications, your needs are going to change, obviously. So when it comes to first getting the products installed, the service application installed, there are many different scripts out in the web to help you get that farm stood up if you haven't already invested in finding some kind of a third-party vendor or contractor to help with it. If it's something you're having your internal resources do, there are scripts, there's information out there that they can run to give basically a default set up installation of these, so at least your farm is up and running and the users can start leveraging it. Okay. Once you start to grow, or you start to notice that, okay, maybe search, isn't being as performant as we need to, or I want to do more with Excel services, for example, if you do need to start tweaking, that's when you can start reaching out again to, vendors or contractors to see how can I find somebody with this specialized knowledge to step in and help out. So this is one of the areas that does get a little bit more vague as far as, okay, do I need a SharePoint person or not? So what phase you're at? Are you installing and getting the service application set up initially just to get it up and running? Or do you really need to do any kinds of tweaking? If you need to dig in and really start playing with some of the ways that these products can be tweaked and reconfigured to be more performant and more robust for your farm, we definitely recommend getting in touch with somebody that has that knowledge. I'm sure there are people out there, there's always an exception to the rule. So I'm sure there's some very intelligent folks out there that can read some of the articles and be ready to rock and roll and help with some of this. But keep in mind that they can be pretty involved. So you may want to reach out and find a resource, with some specialized permission or specialized knowledge in these areas. Okay, training. So this is another one that, again, most people is like, well, what's this have to do with managing SharePoint? It kind of harkens back to our earlier slide about the content, okay? So the more you're going to empower your users, the more you need to make sure that you've given them training, okay? If you've trained your users on how to use SharePoint properly, you've discussed and communicated your governance plan to them, you are going to greatly reduce the frustration that your end users will have. You're going to increase your adoption, and you're going a long way to help prevent the SharePlosion that we mentioned earlier, okay? Empower your users, give them the knowledge that they need so they can continue to help you help them. So the variety of different kinds of training that's out there, you've got, the customary instructor-led training, right? Be in the classroom right there with the instructor. There's also the online with an instructor. So there's a live instructor, but you can do it from your business or the comfort of your home and work with those folks that way, or your own self-paced kind of CBT training. These are the three main types of training that we see that's available. Two companies that we know and have worked with in the past are Critical Path and MindSharp. There are many other companies out there with many different types of resources and formats, what's available. They may come to your location to train. They may require you to fly out to their location or the CBT. There's a lot of varieties there, but we know the resources in Critical Path and MindSharp. So, those are two that we'd recommend and just make you aware of. But again, the more you want to let your users be responsible for in your SharePoint farm to help manage it, the more critical it is that you give them the training they need. Leveraging vendor support. So Ted's touched to this on a couple of the slides, especially when we start talking about the DBAs or some of the service applications. So there's any number of vendors that could be out there for people to work with and to get some information. And rather than having, again, your full-time SharePoint team, leverage what vendors are out there to help address certain specific issues or areas of concern that you might have. There's going to be some different variety for what you're going to get from that vendor, how they're going to give that support and how they're going to work with you. They can be and usually are just going to be a fractional resource. That's one of the benefits for it. You need them for a specific task or issue, let them come in, take care of it, and then it's done. They can do whatever knowledge transfer to somebody who might take over some of that responsibility for whatever the issue is that you're trying to address. But it's not a full-time person that you have to have on board all the time. Different vendors, they may offer like a staff augmentation type of role. We're going to have you work with our team and help our team get up and running and produce whatever needs to be produced and put in place. There are areas that can help you with your administration and maintenance of your SharePoint farms. How can you make sure that, we're running, as best we can? Are we set up with best practices? Is it running the way we need to? Or we know there's an issue and we have to add another server or two to our farm to improve the performance and, or offer different services to help with search. The custom development. So if you know that there's a specific capability that you want to build and install in SharePoint, there's several vendors out there that can help you, develop and create those applications for you and get those deployed for you. And yes, we do know somebody that works great with SharePoint. The migrating to SharePoint Online. We mentioned this one again because the purpose is how can I manage SharePoint, have SharePoint without having this full-blown SharePoint team. So migrating to SharePoint Online could be an area that you'd want to look at, right? So some of the pros, these are by no means a comprehensive comparison of pros and cons to SharePoint Online. That could be a whole other presentation on its own. But some of your pros are you don't have the hardware to maintain. Right? So now you don't have to have that specialized setup for your maintaining the hardware and having the staff on board for that. Updates are done automatically. And to me, this is kind of, we also see about updates in the cons, right? It's kind of a double-edged sword and opinions vary tremendously, but Microsoft rolls out the changes to SharePoint Online first. So the good news is you're always getting the latest and greatest first before it goes to any other, on-premise version of the product. The bad news is you're going to get those updates whether you want them or not. They're going. The only thing you can do, the only real control you have over, is to kind of delay it. You can either be what they like an early adopter, so you're going to be one of the first people to get it once they start releasing the updates, or it may be delayed, X amount of time, few weeks to a month, something like that. But you will get the update. Going online, there's definitely a lot of cost savings there when you start taking into account the cost of hardware and maintenance, the staff to maintain them. You have global access already because it's in the cloud, right? It's already available, so all you need is access to an internet browser, and you can get to your SharePoint sites. And it's one of the more secure environments out there. I know they've also been running, I think as of last quarter, they were running up to 4 nines of uptime, and they fully expect to be up to 6 nines before the end of the year. Now, again, some of the cons to touch on, there are limitations around the branding, what you can do to customize the look and feel for your site. You want to be careful with that, again, because of different updates they throw out. There's certain areas you probably don't want to modify or get rid of, try and hide, things like that, because it may cause problems with updates they roll out later. If you have already a lot of full trust customizations, or you're looking at some third-party vendors to provide you certain functionality, if it has to be a full trust solution, that won't, you can't install that in SharePoint Online. So a couple other things that we wanted to throw out if you're migrating, moving into SharePoint Online. Again, the full trust web parts won't be able to come over. At this time, you can't upload files larger than 10 gigabytes in size, all right? Now, what I'll throw out there is one little caveat. If you have videos, right, that's the common one, video and audio files that can be quite large at times. Your SharePoint Online, your Office 365 tenant, does include a special video portal, if you will. So there's a special section where you can upload those files, and those can be larger than 10 gigabytes. When migrating, files that going into SharePoint can't have certain special characters, right? Because it's a web-based interface with SharePoint. So some characters like the ampersand, %sign, the hashtag, those cannot be contained in your file names or folder names. One of the things I want to throw out here is like, yes, we have those as illegal characters, and then it's, oh, what do I do? What do I do? They're the products that we mentioned earlier, like ShareGate and Metalogic's product that does the migration. They offer options to you that when you're migrating this content, rather than having that content not get put into SharePoint, you can have it so that it will rename the product, rename that file or folder, so that instead of an ampersand, you could replace it with like an underscore, a character that is allowed. So at least the content gets up there, but you do have to keep in mind that that does change the name of the file. So what impact is that going to have on your user? That's something to keep in mind. But again, a lot of cost savings. There's a lot of pluses to moving to SharePoint Online that could make it a compelling offer for you to take a look at. Private cloud option. We mentioned this one. So again, the goal is how can I manage SharePoint? So how can I have a SharePoint world without having this full-time team and getting access and setting it up? If you have a private cloud option, basically what you're doing is setting up a data center outside of your hardware that you may own and have in place already. So this allows you to get a SharePoint environment. You can leverage third-party vendors, outside contractors to manage that farm, work with that farm out in the cloud without giving them or exposing your systems internally. So that can be a compelling reason. So you've got your SharePoint, you're putting the appropriate content in SharePoint and managing it, and you've got somebody else handling that, from a vendor or contractor perspective to help save on cost. But everything that you need to keep isolated and keep secure, again, for whatever your compliance constraints might be, that stays inside your data center and remains there, right? So you now can create full trust apps in those cloud option databases. You're now more in control of the hardware and what you can do and some of the customizing that's available, right? But you still have that privacy of it's in the cloud and it's in its own space, and let people access that without necessarily giving them access to your internal collateral. When it comes to customizing, so again, we touched on, you've got this SharePoint farm, it's installed, you're managing it, everything seems to be running okay, but you want to change the look and feel of the site. So depending on what you want to do and the extent of it, right, there's several different options. SharePoint out of the box comes with many different looks and feels for it, okay, especially the newer SharePoint 2013 and 2016. So they've got lots of themes to change the look and feel, the fonts, the colors of your SharePoint site. If none of those looks work for you, there are several different websites out that offer their own pre-made themes. Two that we mentioned here is the topsharepoint.com and bindtuning.com. These are a couple of sites that we've worked with in the past. And they offer both free templates, right? If it's simple colors and font changes, the more complex it's going to be, then you may get into some that cost you some money. So, and the prices vary tremendously. It all depends on exactly how complex you want to make it. But again, rather than having a full, branding team and working with that, here are a couple of resources that, might be able to fit the bill and do what you need to do with them. When adding an app, so if you're in SharePoint Online, they already have the SharePoint App Store set up and available for you. The SharePoint App Store is where companies can create applications to enhance, give you some additional features or capabilities, or maybe even enhance some of the interactions that you might have. You want a special look for your calendars. There are applications that you can install from companies to give you just that kind of capability, all the way down to more full-blown business processes. So these apps are available for you to install into your SharePoint farm. You can also, if you're running on-prem, you can still set up a SharePoint App Store. But we definitely wanted to caution that, getting that App Store installed in your SharePoint on-prem farm, it's definitely, there is no easy button. There's definitely some configuration and things to get set up and put in place. So we would recommend definitely get in touch with somebody who's done it and knows what they're doing to get that up and running for you. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of very intelligent network and hardware folks out there, but to play it safe, you might want to reach out to somebody who's got experience with it and knows what to do, how to work with the different certificates, what IIS sites you need to set up, what you need to turn on in SharePoint, etc., to get that going. Now, there's different flavors of an app model also. So if you, depending on the skill set that you have internally to get some customizations, you can leverage, like a SharePoint hosted app is one of the terms they have, and that's largely client-side code. Your JavaScript and HTML, it's all can be stored in different SharePoint libraries, and SharePoint lists have that content, and it runs there in the browser for your end users. If you want something that's more complex, then you may have to go with like a provider hosted app. That one definitely gets a lot more involved and is, again, you should work with some third-party folks to getting that set up. Make sure that you've got the App Store in the app world installed in your on-prem farm. So definitely reach out to somebody who knows what they're doing on that front. Okay. Now that's largely what we've covered. We're going to do a quick overview. So we've now kind of given you some information about what's available on SharePoint Online, some of the pros and cons there. Leverage your existing network teams and databases, right? The resources that you already have. Make sure give them some additional information, or let them take over and do a lot of the support. It's the same job they're doing for any of your existing information. You've got the Azure or the cloud options for storing your SharePoint farm. Train your users. I'm going to stress that one again. Make sure you give them training. Let them know the right way to do things, before you set them loose. That it's a lot easier to get ahead of these problems before they become a bigger issue. What products? Several different products that could be out there to help you. The ShareGate products, Engage, MetaLogix, SQL Sentry, SharePoint services. So lots of tools out there. Get the right tool for the right job. And then obviously vendor support. Reach out to some vendors, some different third-party companies and contractors to help take over the more complex areas that you might need some help with. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Ted to finish things up for us.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned really the three high-level strategies, which are outsource, automate, or eliminate. And vendors can help you with all three. AcroWire can help you with the outsourcing of the management of the environment. So, if you provide or we can provide a full enterprise SharePoint team, all of those roles that we talked about earlier, and that's going to help you keep your environment up and running smoothly and end users happy. And so, since we have those full suite of capabilities, we can also help with upgrades, enhancements, etc. If you want to automate, a vendor like AcroWire can help build automation routines to do things like site provisioning, archiving inactive sites, reporting on security exceptions, etc. So, once those, that's typically project work where you hire a vendor to come in and automate certain tasks. That's going to reduce your reliance on an internal SharePoint team. And then finally, if you want to eliminate complexity, get help evaluating what workloads might be appropriate for the cloud, if the cloud is an option. I know that's tricky business and legal, but if you're not ready for a pure cloud scenario, have a vendor like AcroWire build a roadmap for a transition, maybe into a hybrid environment. Maybe there are some workloads that can be hosted in SharePoint Online, and maybe some that stay on-prem or in Azure, where you have control over the server and exactly where your data lives. And that's the presentation. We'd be glad to answer any questions, Gail, if there are any.
Okay, well, thanks, Ted and Brian, for your presentation. And again, once again, AcroWire for their sponsorship. If any of the guests have Q&A, any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box for us. While we're waiting for any final questions, I'd like to mention that a copy of the PowerPoint document and a link to the recording will be posted on our website in a few days. Look under Resources, Recording, and Webinar on our website. Shortly after the webinar, you'll receive a request for you to evaluate today's webinar. These are very important to ILTA and will help us continue to provide quality and timely educational opportunities to our members. Okay, Ted, doesn't look like there's any questions.
We nailed it, I guess.
Yeah, you did. Any final thoughts before we close this off?
Well, if somebody wants, has some needs or anything that they think AcroWire can help them out with their farm, please reach out to us. We have the info@acrowire.com. So we'd love to hear from you and see how we can help you out. And hopefully we've answered some questions and maybe allayed some of your fears about, can some of your team members handle SharePoint if you're looking at getting installed and up and running with your firm?
Okay, we do have a question. The question is, what is standard FTE SharePoint admin headcount per medium-sized firm?
Okay, I'll take a swing at that one. So there's a really high variance. I'll give you on average, and by medium-sized firm, I would say that I'm going to use the ILTA, the way ILTA segments firms, which is 150 to, what is it, Gail? Is it 349? And 350 to 700, I think, is in the middle of the pack where ILTA segments. And on average, on the lower end of that spectrum, we typically only see an administrator, a SharePoint administrator. And Brian, you want to go back to the SharePoint team slide?
Yeah.
I kind of point out some of the roles. So SharePoint administrator will typically see in that 150 and up scenario. In the 350 and up, we'll often see a solutions developer and a shared resource on user experience. So maybe they have somebody on staff who manages the updates to their public-facing site, who also can get in there and do some basic SharePoint design. Those are typically, there's some unique things about the way SharePoint allows you to customize the branding experience. So if they haven't been trained in that, they probably can't go deep. And that's usually it. In the 700 and up attorney realm, we see all of these roles, and in fact, we sometimes see multiple. We have one client that they must have 8 or 9 dedicated SharePoint people, but that's really the exception. I mean, that's at the top of the AmLaw list, and they have a very heavy investment in SharePoint. At the lower end of the list, it's usually a SharePoint administrator, and sometimes that's also your network administrator. So they're wearing a lot of hats.
Okay, well, thank you, Ted. And that's the only question we have. So once again, thank you, Ted and Brian, for your expertise. And everyone else, please keep an eye on our website for any upcoming meetings and webinars. We look forward to seeing you on future webinars. And as ILTA's Executive Director, Randy Mays, always says, tell a friend about ILTA. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.